They tell me I should feel grateful. The Medicae officers, the priests who come to anoint my bandages, the commissar who visited once to pin a small iron medal to my pillow because they couldn't pin it to my chest, all of them speak of gratitude as if it were a sacrament I should embrace. The Emperor protects, they say. The Emperor chose you, and I lie here in this recovery ward on a world whose name I've already forgotten, staring at a ceiling I can only half see, and I try to feel anything at all resembling thankfulness. But there's only the smell of counterseptic and burned meat that never quite leaves my nostrils, and the white flash that lives behind my eyes even when I close them, and the question that nobody will answer: why am I the only one who survived Heavy Weapons Team Tertius? I've asked the Medicae. I've asked the orderlies who change my fluid bags and apply fresh synth skin to the places where my own skin used to be. I've asked the priest who murmurs benedictions over me each morning, his incense doing nothing to mask the reek of my own cooking flesh that seems embedded in my very skull. They all say the same thing: the Emperor's will, providence, a miracle of faith. But none of them were there in that trench when the Lascannons screamed and the world turned white. And none of them can tell me why Voronin pushed me instead of pulling me, why the power cell made that sound for 3 shots before the 4th, why I can still hear Kellum laughing at something Dross said a half-second before they both ceased to exist in any form that could be called human. My name is Guardsman Piotr Vanek, tertiary gunner of the 7th Heavy Weapons Platoon, and I am 23 years old, though I look considerably older now. The Medicae say the burns will heal, mostly. They say the synth skin grafts are taking well, that the augmetic lens they've installed in my left eye socket will eventually sync with my optical nerves, that the hearing in my right ear may return to 40% functionality within the year. They speak of my recovery as if I am being reassembled, which I suppose I am. They do not speak of the men who were not reassembled. They do not speak of what remains of Heavy Weapons Team Tertius, which is only me, and which is therefore nothing at all. I should start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like something that happened to a different man. Perhaps it did. We had been deployed to the aggro world of Kessler's Reach for 6 standard months, when the enemy finally broke through the northern defensive line. I say enemy, because I still don't know exactly what we were fighting. The briefings called them renegades, former Imperial citizens who had turned from the Emperor's light, but the creatures I saw in those final hours wore human skin the way a child wears a costume, badly and with pieces showing through that shouldn't show. They had been human once. They had stopped being human sometime before we met them. That's all I know for certain, and that's all that matters for the purposes of this account. Kessler's Reach was supposed to be a simple garrison posting. The world produced grain and protein stock for 3 neighboring systems, and our regiment had been assigned to protect the primary silos from a minor insurgency that the Administratum had classified as localized unrest requiring pacification. We laughed about that classification during the Parsec first month. Localized unrest, as if the night raids and the screaming in the darkness and the bodies we found each morning with their faces removed were merely administrative inconveniences. Sergeant Voronin told us to stop laughing by the 2nd month. He had seen something in the eyes of the prisoners we took, something that made him check and recheck the power cells of our Lascannon each night before he slept. He never told us what he saw. Now I understand that he couldn't have explained it even if he'd tried. Heavy Weapons Team Tertius consisted of 5 men. Sergeant Voronin, who had served in 8 campaigns, and walked with a slight limp from a wound he never discussed. Corporal Kellum, who kept a small book of poetry hidden in his kit and read from it when he thought no one was watching. Specialist Droz, our spotter, who could identify enemy positions from a kilometer away and who laughed at everything, especially things that weren't funny. Private Amsler, who was 17 and had been with us only 3 weeks, and who called his mother's name at the end, and me, Tertiary Gunner Vanek, whose job was to maintain the power cells and feed them into the breach, and make sure the weapon that would kill us all was always ready to fire. The Lascannon was a Vendetta pattern Mark IV, old but reliable, inherited from a team that had died on a world none of us could pronounce. It had scoring on its barrel from some ancient firefight and a small scratch on the stock where someone had carved initials that had worn away to illegibility. We called it the Old Lady because Kellum insisted all weapons needed names, and because there was something almost maternal about the way it would warm up before firing, a gentle hum that Voronin said was the machine spirit greeting us. I don't know if I believe in machine spirits. I know that the Old Lady made a different sound on the morning she killed my friends. I know that sound wakes me every night in this Medicae ward, and that I hear it even now, as I try to organize my memories into something resembling coherence. The attack came at dawn on the 173rd day of our deployment. I remember this because Drosh had been counting the days, marking them on his arm with a stylus, and he had shown me the mark for 173 just before the first explosions rippled across the northern perimeter. 173 days of garrison duty, of boredom and paranoia, and the slow grinding fear that turns men into something harder than they were before. We had thought we were ready for anything. We had thought wrong. The renegades came through the grain fields in a wave that seemed impossible, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, pouring through breaches in the defense line that shouldn't have existed. Later I learned that the breaches had been opened from inside, that members of our own garrison had been compromised, that the enemy had been among us for months, wearing human faces and human uniforms, and waiting for the signal. At the time, I knew only that the Vox was screaming with reports of breakthrough after breakthrough, that the sky was filled with smoke, and the acrid green flare of weapons that weren't quite lasfire, and that Sergeant Voronin was shouting for us to take position in the forward trench and hold until reinforcement arrived. We set up the Old Lady in the designated emplacement, a ferrocrete bunker that overlooked the main approach to Silo Tertius. The position was good elevated, with clear sightlines and solid cover, but I remember feeling a cold unease as I loaded the first power cell into the breach. The cell made a sound as it seated, a faint whine, almost too high to hear, that I had never noticed before. I mentioned it to Voronin. He looked at me, looked at the cell, looked at the horde of enemies pouring toward us across the burning fields, and told me to fire when ready. There wasn't time for caution. There wasn't time for anything. Kellum called targets. Drosh spotted. I fed cells into the breach while Voronin worked the firing mechanism with a precision born of 2 decades of service. The Old Lady spoke again and again, her voice a crack of superheated light that carved lines of destruction through the advancing enemy. Each shot dropped a dozen of them, sometimes more. I watched bodies vaporize, saw limbs separate from torsos in clouds of flash-boiled blood, smelled the distinctive copper and ozone reek that meant the weapon was working as intended. For 10 minutes, maybe 15, we held that line. For 10 minutes, we were the wall against which the darkness broke. Then the darkness stopped breaking. They pulled back, the renegades, not in retreat but in reorganization. I watched through the magnification of my monocular as they gathered perhaps 300 meters away, massing for another push. Voronin used the pause to check our ammunition. We had expended 14 power cells. We had 19 remaining. At the rate we were firing, that gave us perhaps another hour of sustained combat. After that, we would be reduced to lasguns and bayonets, which against those numbers meant we would be reduced to corpses. It was during this lull that I heard the sound again, the whine from the power cells. It was louder now, or perhaps I was simply listening more closely. I pulled one of the cells from the ammunition case and examined it. The casing looked normal standard Militarum issue, stamped with the Aquila and a production code and the date of manufacture. But when I held it close to my ear, I could hear something inside it. A vibration, a wrongness. The cell felt warm in my hands, warmer than it should have been. I showed it to Voronin. He took the cell, turned it over, pressed his ear to its casing the same way I had. His face changed. I saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or fear, or the particular resignation of a man who understands that his choices have narrowed to none. He placed the cell back in the ammunition case. He told me they were fine. He told me to prepare to fire. Corporal Kellum noticed. He was watching Voronin's face the same way I was, reading something in the set of the sergeant's jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "Problem, sir?" he asked. His voice was casual. His eyes were not. "No problem," Voronin said. "Just old equipment. The machine spirit is restless." Dross laughed at that. He laughed at everything. "Machine spirit doesn't like Xenos any more than we do," he said. "Can't blame the old girl for wanting to burn them all. I should have pushed harder. I should have insisted we check the cells more thoroughly, that we swap them for fresh ones from another team, that we do something other than what we did." But the enemy was massing again, and the Vox was full of desperate calls for fire support, and Voronin was my sergeant, and he had said they were fine. 8 campaigns, 20 years of service. I trusted him the way a child trusts a parent. I trusted him. And because of that trust, I am the only one left alive to tell you what happened when the darkness came back. They came faster this time. I don't know what changed. Perhaps their leaders had reorganized them. Perhaps they had simply found their courage. Perhaps the things that drove them forward had grown tired of waiting. They came across the burned fields in a tide of twisted flesh, and we fired into them, and for every one we killed there were 10 more behind. The old lady grew hot beneath our hands. The ferrocrete walls of our emplacement shook with the impact of enemy fire. Amsler was praying, his voice barely audible beneath the roar of combat. He was reciting something his mother had taught him, a prayer to the Emperor for protection. I remember thinking that the Emperor was very far away, and that we were very alone, and that prayers seemed a thin shield against the tide of screaming hatred that was closing the distance between us with every passing second. I loaded cell after cell. 14, 15, 16. Each one made the sound, that high thin whine that I could hear even through the chaos of battle. Each one felt too warm in my hands. I told myself it was the heat of the weapon, the normal thermal build-up from sustained fire. I told myself it was nothing. I kept loading because there was nothing else to do, because stopping meant dying, because faith in my sergeant and faith in the machine spirit and faith in the Emperor's protection were all I had left. Cell 17 was the one that killed them. I remember the moment with a clarity that no amount of sedatives or cogitator-assisted therapy has been able to dim. I had just slotted the cell into the breach. The indicator light had flickered green charged. Ready. Functional. Voronin had his hand on the firing mechanism. Kellum was calling out a target, a cluster of enemies perhaps 50 meters out, close enough that I could see the wrongness of their faces, the way their mouths hung open too wide and their eyes reflected light that wasn't there. Dross was laughing again, that high nervous laugh that meant he was terrified, but refusing to show it. Amsler was still praying, and I was reaching for cell 18 when Sergeant Voronin looked at me, just looked. His eyes met mine, and in that fraction of a second I saw everything he hadn't told me. I saw that he knew. I saw that he had known since I first showed him the cell, maybe before. I saw the decision he had made to keep firing, to hold the line, to spend our lives in defense of a silo full of grain that would feed people we would never meet on worlds we would never see. I saw him accept what was about to happen with a calm that I will never, ever understand. Then he pushed me. His hand hit my chest like a hammer. I flew backward out of the emplacement, tumbling into the trench behind us, and in the same moment the old lady screamed. Not the clean crack of a Lascannon firing, something else, a shriek of tortured energy, of a power cell giving up its containment, of a machine spirit dying in agony. The world turned white. They tell me a Lascannon power cell contains enough concentrated energy to burn through tank armor. They tell me a catastrophic failure releases that energy not in a focused beam but in all directions simultaneously. They tell me the temperatures involved are comparable to the surface of a star, briefly, impossibly, contained within a space the size of a man's torso. They tell me that anyone within 3 meters of a cell detonation is simply erased, not killed, not burned, but converted from matter into light and heat and a rapidly expanding sphere of destruction. I was 4 meters away. Voronin's push saved my life by the thickness of a single pace. The flash burned through my closed eyelids. I felt rather than saw the fireball that consumed the emplacement, felt the heat wash over me like the breath of a furnace god, felt my uniform ignite, and my skin begin to cook, and my hair turn to ash in the span of a heartbeat. I remember screaming. I remember the ground shaking beneath me as secondary explosions ripped through our ammunition supply. I remember the sound of something that might have been Amsler, still praying, still believing, even as the fire took him. Then there was nothing but the white. I don't know how long I lay in that trench. Hours, maybe. The battle continued around me. I could hear it distantly, through the ringing in my ears and the roar of blood in my skull. At some point, the shooting stopped. At some point, hands grabbed me, pulled me from the trench, loaded me onto something that moved. I remember a Medicae leaning over me, her face haloed by surgical lights, her mouth moving but no words reaching me through the wall of static that had replaced my hearing. I remember pain. I remember the smell of my own flesh, burnt and ruined, filling my nostrils with a sweetness that made me want to vomit. I remember the white flash. I still remember it. I will always remember it. The first thing I saw when my remaining eye finally focused, 3 weeks after the incident, was a commissar standing at the foot of my bed. He was reading from a data slate, his face impassive, his uniform immaculate. He told me that the Battle of Kessler's Reach had been won. He told me that the silos had been saved, that 17 million tons of grain would feed the sector for another year, that the sacrifice of heavy weapons, Team Tertius, had been instrumental in holding the northern approach during the critical hours of the engagement. He told me that Sergeant Voronin had been posthumously awarded the Medallion Crimson, that Corporal Kellum and Specialist Drosh and Private Amsler had been entered into the regiment's roll of honor, that their names would be spoken in prayers of thanksgiving for as long as the regiment endured. He did not tell me why the cell had failed. He did not tell me why Voronin had known. He did not tell me why I had been pushed instead of pulled, saved instead of shared. When I asked, his face closed like a vault door. "The Emperor protects," he said, and left. I spent the next 2 months learning to see through an augmetic eye, and hear through a damaged ear, and move through a body that had been rebuilt from materials that weren't entirely mine. The synth-skin grafts itched constantly, a good sign, the Medicae said, meaning the nerves were reconnecting. The eye took longer. For weeks I saw only static through it, a flickering wash of grey and white that made me nauseated. Then, slowly, images began to emerge. Fuzzy at first, then sharper. The Medicae ward, the ceiling, the faces of the orderlies who came to check my bandages and adjust my fluid intake and make notes on data slates about my recovery. I began to walk again on the 42nd day. Short distances at first to the end of my bed, to the latrine, to the small window that overlooked the hospital's courtyard. The world outside was grey and cold, an industrial processing station orbiting some world whose name I never learned. Through the window I could see other wounded being moved between buildings, their injuries hidden beneath bandages and robes. I wondered how many of them had been burned. I wondered how many of them remembered the white. It was during one of these walks that I found the file. The Medicae's station was unattended. Just for a moment she had stepped away to answer a summons, leaving her cogitator terminal active. I shouldn't have looked. I know that now. But I had been asking questions for weeks and receiving only silence, and the terminal was right there, and my name was visible on the screen among a list of patients with attached records. I only had time to read a fragment before the Medicae returned. A fragment was enough. The file contained a logistics report from the Militarum division that had supplied our power cells. Buried in the technical jargon and production codes was a flag, a quality control notation indicating that batch 773 Kessler, the batch assigned to heavy weapons Team Tertius, had shown intermittent thermal instability during final testing. The recommendation had been to quarantine the batch for further examination. The recommendation had been overruled due to, and I remember the exact words, supply constraints requiring deployment of all available material. They knew. The Militarum knew. They had sent us cells that their own testing had identified as potentially defective, and they had done it because there weren't enough cells to go around, and someone had decided that the risk was acceptable. Someone sitting at a desk on some other world, someone who had never held a Lascannon or smelled the ozone and copper reek of a firefight, had calculated that the probability of failure was within tolerable parameters. They had weighed our lives against their spreadsheets and found us wanting. I returned to my bed before the Medicae noticed. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the white flash pulse behind my eyes. I thought about Voronin, about the look on his face when he'd held that cell to his ear. He must have recognized the sound. He must have known what it meant. 8 campaigns. 20 years. He would have seen defective equipment before, would have learned to identify the telltale signs. He knew, and he kept firing anyway, because the line had to be held, and there were no other cells, and the alternative was being overrun. He pushed me, because he couldn't save everyone, and he had to save someone. He pushed me, because I was closest. He pushed me because the decision had to be made in a fraction of a second, and there wasn't time to choose rationally. Or perhaps he pushed me because he saw something in me worth preserving, some spark of potential that would justify the sacrifice. I don't know. I will never know. The dead don't explain themselves, and the living aren't told. The commissar returned on the 60th day. This time he brought a medal, the same iron medallion I had seen pinned to my pillow weeks ago, now mounted on a ribbon that he hung around my neck with something approaching ceremony. I asked him why I was being decorated. He told me it was for valor, for continuing to serve my weapon even as the enemy closed to close combat range, for feeding cells into the breach until the very moment of catastrophic failure. He told me I was a hero of the Imperium. I asked him about batch 773 Kessler. I asked him about the quality control flag. I asked him about the supply constraints that had required deployment of defective material. His face didn't change. The machine spirit is mysterious, he said. Sometimes it fails despite our best ministrations. This is not evidence of negligence. It is evidence of the fundamental truth of our existence, that we serve, and sometimes service requires sacrifice. They knew the cells were bad. They knew there was a risk, as there is always a risk. A guardsman who refuses to fight because his weapon might malfunction is not a guardsman at all. He is a coward. You were not a coward, Vanek. You continued to serve. That is what the medal represents. He left before I could respond. The medal hung cold against my chest, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. I understood then what I was being told, though it took me longer to understand why. The regiment visited me the following week, or rather, what remained of it, the survivors of Kessler's Reach, reassembled and resupplied, and preparing to deploy to another world where another enemy threatened another strategic asset. They filed past my bed one by one, men I had trained with and fought beside and watched die in my nightmares. Some of them touched my shoulder. Some of them said words I couldn't hear through the persistent ringing in my right ear. All of them looked at my face at the synth skin grafts and the augmetic eye and the patchwork of scars that had replaced the features I'd been born with, and I saw in their expressions what I would become for them. A symbol, an object lesson, a reminder of what the Emperor demands and what the faithful give. I was discharged from the Medicae facility on the 83rd day, not back to my regiment, but to a new assignment, one that had been arranged without my consultation or consent. I was to be transferred to the commissariat's propaganda division, where my face and my story would serve a different kind of purpose. The hero of Silo Tertius, they called me in the briefing documents, the guardsman who held the line, the man the Emperor chose to save. The truth was simpler and uglier. A burned face is useful. A man rebuilt from wreckage is useful. A survivor of catastrophe, decorated and documented, photographed from angles that emphasize the damage while obscuring the horror. This is a tool that can be wielded as surely as a Lascannon, albeit to different ends. They would parade me before fresh conscripts. They would point to my scars and tell the young men and women of the Imperium that this is what duty looks like, that this is the price of glory. that this is acceptable, normal, desirable even. They would not tell them about batch 773 Kessler. They would not tell them about the quality control flag, or the supply constraints, or the quiet mathematics of acceptable loss. They would tell them only that I had served and survived and been rewarded for my faith. The lesson would be obedience. The truth would be buried. I shipped out on a transport 6 days later. The journey took weeks. We were traveling to a sector administrative hub, a world of spires and cathedrals where the commissariat maintained its recruiting apparatus. I spent the transit in a small cabin, alone, listening to the hum of the ship's engines and trying to reconcile what I had become with what I had been. The man who had loaded cells into the old lady was dead. The thing that remained was something else, something useful. The dreams came every night. They always began the same way, in the trench, reaching for cell 17, watching Voronin's hand move toward my chest. But in the dreams, the push came too late. In the dreams, I remained in the emplacement when the cell detonated. I felt the fire take me the way it took the others, not the glancing burn I had actually experienced, but the full erasure, the conversion from matter to light. And in that moment of obliteration, I understood something. Not peace, not release, just a simple truth that waking robbed from me before I could grasp it fully. The truth, I think, was this, that there is no difference between the men who died and the man who survived. We were all consumed. The only distinction is that some of us kept burning. The administrative world was called Viridia Secundus, and it was everything Kessler's reach had not been. Towering, ornate, dripping with the accumulated wealth of a dozen conquered systems. The spires reached so high that their tops were lost in the perpetual smog, and the streets at their bases were crowded with functionaries and pilgrims and soldiers like myself, all of us cogs in a machine too vast to comprehend. I was assigned quarters in a hab block near the commissariat's central facility. The room was small but clean, better than anything I had known in my years of service. It had a window that looked out over the city, and at night I would stand there watching the lights flicker in the distant towers and wondering which of them had made the decision to ship defective cells to Kessler's reach. My first duty assignment came 3 days after my arrival. I was to address a gathering of fresh conscripts at a training facility on the city's outskirts. The speech had been written for me, a recounting of the Battle of Silo Tertius, carefully edited to emphasize heroism and faith, while excising anything that might suggest the Imperium's supply systems were anything less than perfect. I read through it in my quarters the night before, marking the lies with small dots of ink on the margins. There were many dots by the time I finished. The conscripts were young, younger than Amsler had been, some of them. They sat in neat rows in the training hall, their uniforms crisp and new, their faces unmarked by the wars that would claim them. A commissar introduced me, not the one from the hospital, but another, interchangeable in his black coat and peaked cap, and then I stood before them and began to speak. I said the words I had been given. I told them about duty and sacrifice and the Emperor's protection. I told them about Sergeant Voronin, about Kellum and Drosh and Amsler, about the old lady and the wall we had made of ourselves against the darkness. I told them that I had been saved by faith, that the Emperor's hand had reached down and plucked me from destruction because I was meant to carry on, to serve, to be an example of what devotion could achieve. They believed me. I watched their faces as I spoke, and I saw the belief kindle in their eyes. These children who had never seen combat, never smelled burning flesh, never heard the scream of a dying machine spirit. They looked at my ruined face and saw glory. They saw purpose. They saw themselves, in some imagined future, standing where I stood, honored and decorated and alive. They did not see the lie. They could not see it, because the truth would have broken them. I gave that speech 17 times over the next 3 months. Different facilities, different faces, the same words. Each time, I watched the belief spread through the room like a contagion. Each time, I felt something inside me die a little more. The man who had loaded cells into the old lady would have hated what I was doing. The thing that remained simply did what it was told, because that is what things do. The commissar who had pinned my medal found me after my 11th address. He was waiting in my quarters when I returned, sitting in the room's single chair, as if he belonged there. I shouldn't have been surprised. The commissariat goes where it wishes, but something in his presence felt different. Personal. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, then gestured for me to sit on the bed. "You've been effective," he said. "Recruitment numbers are up. The story resonates." "Yes, sir. But you're troubled by it." I said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. "I've read your file, Vanek. All of it, not just the propaganda version. I know about the logistics report. I know what you found on that terminal." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "I know you understand what really happened at Silo Tertius." Still, I said nothing. The augmetic eye whirred softly as it adjusted to the room's dim lighting. "Let me tell you something that isn't in any file," the commissar continued. "The man who approved the deployment of batch 773 Kessler was named Administratum Factor Hennick. He made that decision because his division was under quota, because his superiors were threatening reassignment to a penal battalion, because the machine of the Imperium demanded cells, and he provided cells, and that is all the Imperium asked of him. He did not know your name. He did not know Voronin's name. He did not hate you or wish you harm. He was simply efficient. Factor Hennick died 6 weeks ago. A transit accident. His shuttle experienced catastrophic drive failure en route to an inspection tour. The commissar's expression didn't change. The failure was logged as mechanical error. Machine spirits are mysterious. I understood then. I understood what I was being told and why. The commissar was not confessing he was recruiting. He was showing me that the Imperium contained systems within systems, that some balances could be adjusted quietly, that efficiency could be turned against the efficient. He was offering me a different kind of service. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing you aren't already giving. Continue the speeches. Continue being the hero of Silo Tertius. But watch. Listen. Remember what you've learned about the gap between the story and the truth. There may come a time when your experience is useful in other ways." He left without another word. I sat in the darkness of my quarters, listening to the hum of the Hab block's life support, thinking about Hennick and his shuttle, and the curious symmetry of mechanical failure. The white flash pulsed behind my eyes. I wondered if Hennick had seen something similar in his final moments, a brightness, an erasure, the understanding that comes too late. The speeches continued. I refined my delivery, learned to pause for effect, to modulate my voice to emphasize the moments of sacrifice and survival. The conscripts continued to believe, the commissariat continued to use me, and slowly, invisibly, I began to watch. There is a machinery to the Imperium that most soldiers never see. Not the physical machinery, the ships and weapons and manufactorums that prosecute the endless wars, but something subtler, a system of information, of favors, of quiet adjustments. I had been inducted into its edges, and from those edges I could see the shapes of larger structures moving in the darkness, decisions made in distant offices that would determine who lived and who died on worlds I would never visit, allocations of resources that favored some regiments and abandoned others, the mathematics of acceptable loss, applied again and again, each time producing a crop of heroes like myself, survivors whose scars could be photographed and whose stories could be edited into something useful. I don't know if I hate the system. Hate requires a clarity of target that the Imperium does not permit. There is no single villain, no face to focus rage upon. There are only factors and variables, and the endless grinding of processes designed to consume humanity in the service of humanity's survival. Hennick was not evil. He was efficient. The cells were not sabotaged. They were misallocated. The men who died at Silo Tertius were not murdered. They were sacrificed, which is different, or so I am told. Voronin understood this. I see that now. He had served for 20 years, and fought in 8 campaigns, and seen 1,000 Hennicks make 1,000 decisions, that balanced lives against logistics. He knew the cells were bad. He knew there were no alternatives. He knew that the line had to be held, and that holding it would cost us everything. And in the moment when all of that knowledge crystallized into action, he made the only choice that was his to make. He pushed me, and by pushing me, he turned my survival into something meaningful, a witness, a rememberer, a small crack in the wall of official narrative through which the truth might, someday, leak. I don't know if I'm grateful. The Medicae who told me I should feel grateful were speaking of something simpler, survival as its own reward, continuation as evidence of blessing. But survival is not simple. Continuation is not clean. I carry with me the white flash, and the smell of burning meat, and the sound of Amsler praying, and the weight of 17 million tons of grain that I helped save by watching my friends die. I carry Voronin's push, that final act of desperate choice, and the knowledge that it was aimed at creating exactly what I have become, a vessel for remembrance, a keeper of uncomfortable truths. The Commissar visits me occasionally, never for long, never with explicit instructions. He asks how I am. He asks if I've seen anything interesting. He nods at my answers and leaves without commenting. I don't know what he's waiting for. I don't know what role I'm being shaped to play. I know only that the shape is forming, that the machinery is working, that somewhere in the vast processes of the Imperium, my survival is being integrated into calculations I cannot perceive. Last week, I gave my 47th speech. The facility was different, a scholam on a moon orbiting Viridia Secundus. Children, even younger than the usual conscripts, but the words were the same. I stood before them with my burned face, and my augmetic eye, and my medal, and told them the story of Silo Tertius. I told them about duty and sacrifice, and the Emperor's protection. I told them what they needed to hear. But this time, at the end, I added something. A small deviation from the script, almost imperceptible. I told them that service sometimes requires sacrifice. I told them that sacrifice sometimes comes from unexpected places. I told them that if they ever found themselves in a position where they had to choose between efficiency and humanity, between the mission and the men, they should remember that the Emperor sees all, even the choices made in the darkness of trenches and the quiet of administratum offices. The Commissar was watching from the back of the room. When I finished, he nodded. Just once, almost imperceptibly. Then he turned and left, and I knew that whatever I was being shaped into, the shaping was almost complete. I don't dream about the white flash anymore. Not because it has faded, it lives behind my eyes still, will live there until I die, but because the dream has changed. Now when I sleep, I stand in the trench at Silo Tertius, and I watch Voronin reach toward me. His hand moves slowly, impossibly slowly, giving me time to see everything. The understanding in his eyes, the acceptance, the choice. And in the dream, I don't fall backward. I reach out and catch his wrist. I hold on as the old lady screams, and the world turns white. I burn with him, the way I was meant to burn, and in the burning we are together. When I wake, my hand is always clenched around nothing. The medal hangs cold against my chest. Outside my window, the spires of Viridia Secundus reach toward a smog-choked sky, and somewhere in those spires, men like Hennick are making decisions that will kill men like Voronin, and men like me are waiting to remember. That is what happens when the Lascannon misfires in close combat. Not the physics of it, the release of energy, the conversion of matter to light, but the aftermath. The survival, the use to which survival is put. We are all cells in the Imperium's magazine, loaded and fired, and sometimes spent in ways that were never intended. The only difference is what remains when the burning stops. Ash, or something that can still be useful. I am useful. The Emperor protects, they tell me. And perhaps he does not through miracles or divine intervention, but through the mathematics of acceptable loss, which sometimes produce a remainder that can be deployed for new purposes. I am that remainder. Voronin's push created me. Hennick's efficiency forged me. The commissariat honed me into what I am now, a weapon of a different kind, pointed at targets I cannot yet see. The next speech is tomorrow. A regiment shipping out to a war zone I'm not permitted to name. They will look at my scars and hear my story and believe that service is glorious and sacrifice is meaningful and the Emperor rewards the faithful. They will believe, because belief is what they need in order to function, in order to fight, in order to die when their time comes. I will give them that belief, wrapped in the careful lies of official narrative, seasoned with just enough truth to make it feel real. And somewhere in the machinery, my careful additions will be noted, my small deviations will be recorded, the commissar will nod, and the shapes moving in the darkness will shift, and the mathematics of acceptable loss will be adjusted by factors I cannot perceive. This is my service now. This is my war. The white flash pulses behind my eyes. I close them and see Voronin's face, frozen in the moment of choice. I open them and see the ceiling of my quarters, grey and featureless, identical to 1,000 other ceilings on 1,000 other worlds. Between the closing and opening, nothing changes. The Imperium endures. The machinery continues. The remainder remains. I am Guardsman Piotr Vanek, hero of Silo Tertius, and I am 23 years old, though I look considerably older now. I have been rebuilt from wreckage into something useful. I have been shaped from survivor into symbol, from witness into weapon. I do not know what I will be asked to do with this weapon. I know only that I will do it, because service is what remains when everything else has burned away. The Emperor protects. The machine spirits are mysterious. The dead don't explain themselves, but the living remember. And sometimes, in the space between the lie and the truth, remembering is enough.